independence, love, social convention, gender roles, and religion. Charlotte Bronte's most famous novel challenges ideas on all these topics, and we are here to discuss it. I'm Charlene.
And I'm Mike.
And this is Jane Eyre Files. Chapter 1. What does Bessie say I have done? Hello, husband.
Hello, Madam Mope.
Oh.
What? That's a good line. I like that nickname.
Welcome to our first discussion of Jane Eyre. Are you excited, Mike?
Yes. I mean, when you first mentioned to me that you wanted to do this podcast, and we said, let's do it one chapter at a time, I thought this would be the way to do it. This would give us a chance to really, really break this down and analyze it, and to make, well, at least to make it more memorable. Because I think if we would have just said we're going to discuss the whole book at once, I mean, it would take forever, and we would be missing a lot of minor stuff. And I want to see what makes this book so meaningful to you. And by going one chapter at a time, I think we got a better chance of doing that.
Yes, I think so. So we'll start with the chapter summary, which I actually pulled from sparknotes.com.
I'm sure there's many a student like me who really, really preferred to get all the summary from SparkNotes without having to read it.
Oh, SparkNotes is a great aid. Chapter 1, the novel opens on a dreary November afternoon at Gateshead, the home of the wealthy Reed family. A young girl named Jane Eyre sits in the drawing room reading Bewick's History of British Birds. Jane's aunt, Mrs. Reed, has forbidden her niece to play with her cousin Eliza, Georgiana, and the bullying John. John chides Jane for being a lowly orphan who is only permitted to live with the Reeds because of his mother's charity. John then hurls a book at the young girl, pushing her to the end of her patience. Jane finally erupts and the two cousins fight. Mrs. Reed holds Jane responsible for the scuffle and sends her to the Red Room, the frightening chamber in which her Uncle Reed died, as punishment. So, the novel famously begins with, there was no possibility of taking a walk that day. And I feel like it's such a understated line, but it's also very portentous because it's like something is going to happen that day, with Jane like finally breaking out of her restraints put on her by the Reeds, where she's always been this obedient, trying to be not like play well with everybody, but they still just dislike her. But now she's going to be passionate and fiery, which was always in her.
But you don't think that would have happened if they would have gone on a walk?
Well, I just like the idea of it being such a mundane kind of beginning, but then it also signals with her next line about how she never really likes going on long walks, of how is a little bit at odds with everybody at Gateshead, where she has her own personality and her own thoughts on these things. It's such a interesting introduction.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, and I think, as we're going to get into with the early days of Jane, is that she's very, very put upon. She is mistreated, and she probably has a real pessimistic view on the world. And I think it's pretty interesting. The very first line is some sort of disappointment.
Yeah.
Right? This idea that she probably might have been really looking forward to the. Well, I guess you said she doesn't really like the long walks, but
it almost you think that she might like it.
Yeah,
that's the way she stated it.
Because you don't know that she doesn't like until you kind of because that's like you said, it's a very bizarre first line, because you're like, oh, you're already setting up for some sense of disappointment, where it's just kind of like, woe is me, she's the Debbie Downer, and that's you're kind of you're saying that, but and you're hoping that at least if you start low, then it's only going to get better. Hopefully, there will be better days ahead, and that's we're going to slowly see it kind of chip away.
Yeah. So, what were your initial thoughts rereading this for the second time?
Well, the first chapter is short.
That's true. Very short.
I can appreciate that. I think in the copy of the book that I have, which you very nicely got from me,
reading it
from the Bronte parsonage, I believe it's only 4 pages.
Yeah.
And so, again, I don't read a lot. And so it was nice to have a good introductory chapter. I wanted, I know there's not pressure on us. I want this podcast to be good because I know how much this means to you and how much this book means to you. Mm-hmm. And so because it was so short, it allowed me to reread some of the paragraphs, 2-3 times, mm-hmm. look for meaningful quotes, and also try to make sure that I can really capture it because the book does take you away. Mm-hmm. You close your eyes and you're reading it, or you visualize as you're reading it, and you are at Gateshead. That's and true. You are in this room reading a book with Jane, and you're dealing with her little pissant cousin, and so that's kind of what it is. It's brief enough to where it grabs you quickly. Like what I said, it kind of sets up a depressing tone for her character, but it also does a really good job of setting the stage for the rest of the book.
And it's funny that you said that you reread some of the paragraphs, because I remember when I first read it in high school that the first couple chapters, I think, I was bored. I didn't quite follow what was going on because maybe I was distracted about something, so I had to go back to the first page and start over just to figure out, okay, who is John Reed again, and what was happening? Why were they fighting? So it was kind of weird, but obviously that all turned around, and I was a big fan afterwards. But I do sometimes think about how that first chapter somehow didn't capture me when I was young, but now I feel like there's so much going on that John Reed is, like you said, just a pissant, just so annoying, and he doesn't get redeemed. You don't feel better towards him later on, which is an interesting point, but I guess he just doesn't deserve it. And
what I thought, like I said, I thought was really curious in rereading it by going back and reading some of the paragraphs multiple times is that Jane's backstory is all referenced through John. And so, I don't know if in the mid 19th century, if it was this patriarchal society, where
yes, it was.
Well, sure, but Charlotte published this book with using like a pseudonym that was sort of androgynous, right? Because she was worried she wanted people to think it was from a man that wrote it. And yet here, this is your title character. And the very first time you hear that she's 10 years old is not her saying, I'm 10 years old. It's saying, John Reed is 14 years old, 4 years older than me. As if, it's that whole thing with the Bible, right? Where it's like, isn't Eve created off of Adam's rib? Or whatever. It's right. Like, and so it's just like, this is Jane Eyre. We're supposed to know who she is, but yet it's like, well, John is this old, and that's how old I am.
Yeah.
And then when you get later, when they're having this really heated argument, the rest of Jane's backstory all comes with these insults being hurled at her by John.
Yeah.
I joke about it all the time.
You're dependent.
Well, yeah, I joke about it all the time when you talk about the idea of exposition, which is something that they taught us when I took screenwriting classes in film school, is, you see it a lot in like police movies, right? Where it's always the detective goes in to see his boss, and then that's usually where you get the exposition, right? Is the chief going, all right, you've been busted for how many times, and I'm gonna have to, and that's it's interesting to watch movies, and I'm sure you probably will catch it. And maybe you won't, haven't done this before, and maybe you'll do this going forward now. Is watch the way that exposition is delivered, because all screenwriters have to find a way to squeeze it in somehow, and then rather than have it be a voiceover, it's usually some random dialogue. And so in this, it's basically a 14-year-old kid insulting a little girl by saying, you're this and you're that and you're an orphan and we're only taking you in because of this. And so it's I kind of like that aspect of it. I mean, it's mean-spirited, but it is sort of better than having her say, I'm an orphan and my aunt took me in. Instead, it's this little punk kid kind of using it as a.
You've no business taking our books. You're a dependent. You've no money. Your father left you none.
Yeah, I like you said, John being kind of the focus in this chapter because he's just such an unrelenting bully to Jane. So it's like that's pretty much all that she worries about at this time is how am I going to keep John from hitting me or annoying me or saying mean things to me, because everyone else seems to treat her with indifference for the most part. So John, is also thinking that, oh, well, everything is going to be mine when I'm older. This book will be mine. So, you better be nice to me because I'm going to be the master. He's going to be a brat because he has so much power. And unfortunately, at that time, that's the way it was. Men had all the power.
Yeah, I mean, and that was one of the surprising things when I was rereading this. Again, it's only 4 pages, but John seems to get like as much time in the narrative as Jane does.
Yes.
And I think I mentioned to you off the air that I found it interesting that, they note Charlotte Bronte notes that John is home from school because he has some sort of illness, some unexplained illness. And perhaps his mother is attributing that to homesickness, But then Charlotte later says that John had, quote, not much affection, end quote, towards his mother. And so I was just thinking, like, is this just a case of like a doting mother and an embarrassed son? Oh, mom, like I've been there. My mother probably, would embarrass me at times because you're so proud of you, I guess. And I was going to ask you, like, I'm sure your mother did the same thing, right? Where this is my daughter, Charlene, and she's a scientist, and she, and then so you're like, oh, okay, mom. And so I'm sure a 14-year-old boy especially probably is not like
wants to
totally enamored with his mother.
Distance himself, yeah. Well, I mean, it's interesting, like you said. I think that Mrs. Reed has a lot of affection for her children. You see it more with John probably than you do with Eliza and Georgiana, and it's just juxtaposed between this antipathy she has for Jane, where nothing Jane does is good enough, and she does not want to see her, basically. She doesn't want to hear her. She doesn't believe anything she says, and she's always underhanded. She's an underhanded little thing. And it's unfortunate because Mrs. Reed possibly could be a good mother. Obviously, she overindulged John, and that was not good. But she had a lot of love for her children. And I feel like that has a little bit of a redemptive side for Mrs. Reed, even though, John doesn't have a redemptive side. So it's interesting. Yeah,
and I think I was hoping there would be more with the daughters.
Yes.
I mean, I guess it's just the first chapter. Only 4 pages. And so I'm you want to believe that. I would assume at this point, Mrs. Reed is telling her kids, don't associate with Jane. She's only here because of, as I said, she's a charity case. She doesn't get the same luxuries that they get. But I as you're reading it, as a reader, you want to believe there's good in people. And I mean, even if you know that John is probably very indicative of the male society in the mid 19th century. There's a part of you that wants to believe that the daughters, Lizzie, Georgiana, you're hoping as the chapters go along while they're still back at Gateshead, perhaps one of them will, if you don't know what's coming, you're going to assume that Jane's going to get in trouble somehow and punished, and then one of those 2 girls is probably might find a soft side and be like, hey, here's some bread from the dinner table that you were denied or something.
Yeah, you don't see much from them, but I find it interesting in some adaptations that they have Eliza and Georgiana just kind of egging John on, just in the background. So, like in the book, he's by himself and he's torturing Jane privately. But I think it is good to see that Eliza and Georgiana are also kind of, thinking the way that he thinks, where they don't have any respect for Jane and they feel like she's a little bit of a burden and they don't like her.
Well, and what's funny too is, for being this patriarchal society and the fact that John kind of dominates the narrative, I did think it was funny that I forget which one it is, either Eliza or Georgiana, is the one who finds Jane in the room.
Oh, yeah. Because she's smarter than John.
Yeah, because she's smarter. Yeah. And I wrote the quote down because I thought it was really funny. But the way Charlotte describes John, she says, he was not quick either of vision or conception.
Yeah.
And so I'm like...
That's a burn.
Yeah. He's looking around the room, and then the girl comes in and just like, she's over there.
Yeah.
Idiot, right behind the curtain. How do you not see that? But she's in this room, and she's reading. And I got to ask you, because I know you're a big reader as well, have you ever read any of the books that are referenced in Chapter 1 of Jane Eyre? Are you familiar with the plots and how they might compare and contrast?
Well, I will say that on my website, eyreguide.com, I have a list of all the books referenced in Jane Eyre, things that she alludes to, and is quoted from, and then where did that quote come from. So I've kind of made it a little bit of a project to read as many of those books as I can. But unfortunately, I think of the books in the first chapter, I've only read the one, which is Pamela. And that was a while ago. I don't think it's very good.
What's the plot? You remember the plot?
Yeah, it's kind of a funny foreshadowing because it's about a servant, and her name's Pamela. And she gets basically sexually harassed by her employer, who's this rich kind of rake, and he just wants to kind of sleep with her, but she has all these morals. She doesn't want to give that up. She wants to be an honest woman. He eventually reforms, and he marries her, and that is the happily ever after in that book. The other books, Henry Earl of Moreland, I think, and then, of course, the Goldsmith's History of Rome. Have not read those.
Bewick's History of British Birds.
So that's funny because I wouldn't mind reading that because it's such a important part of the first chapter where Jane describes the pictures, and I think Charlotte Bronte had a copy of that when she was growing up. You know, it makes me think that she probably had that same kind of thing of looking at these pictures as a child and what she thought of them, and she just brought that to young Jane. So I think, it would be interesting to find that. But if you look on Amazon or something, it's very expensive. It's like a reprint.
Oh,
yeah,
right.
it's not quite worth it to me to buy it. But there's probably some pages that you can find online and stuff.
So Charlotte Bronte had a book about birds, and it helped inspire Jane Eyre. Very similar to Ian Fleming had a book about birds sitting on his coffee table, and the author of that book was James Bond.
Oh, right.
And that's where the character James Bond comes from.
Jane and James.
Jane and James. Yeah. And we get a bird reference, right? I mean, I think this whole book, as we're going to get into with these, as we go chapter at a time, there's lots and lots of bird references with Jane.
Yes, Jane is often referred to as a bird by Mr. Rochester, and I think it's kind of fun because I think Jane is kind of like a bird. She's trapped, in these.
How so, Shelley?
Well, she's trapped in these Victorian social standards. She can't, do many things. She doesn't have many options open to her, which we'll see later on when she decides that after being a teacher, she doesn't want to do that anymore. She wants to do something else. She wants to do something where she can see more people and places. And one of the things that she says is, grant me a new servitude, which is kind of depressing to think that, well, that's the only option open to me is something different, some different avenue of serving someone that I can do. And because she doesn't have any money, she doesn't have any well-off connections that we know of yet, but she has a expansive mind that is ready to take on the world, and that's this book.
Oh, and like a bird, if you put a blanket over her, she falls asleep. But
I don't remember that part in the book.
No, isn't she hiding behind a curtain and she's just going to knock right out?
Oh, okay, I see.
But the funny thing too, and I know you've asked me about this before. She's 10 years old. She's running into a room and she's just reading. Now I know 10-year-old Charlene, probably that's like the dream.
Love
but
it.
I would imagine a lot of this has to do with the fact that there's nothing. What else is there to do? Especially if it's raining outside and there's no possibility of taking a walk that day.
Nice pull.
You have to. I'm sure people read a lot, and so I was thinking about what was I reading at the age of 10. I'm sure you're going to have better answers than I do, but I was thinking like that. I'm guessing that I'm at the end of my elementary school years, I was reading Choose Your Own Adventure books.
Oh, yes,
I
read those.
Probably the extent of what I did. I know I read, I had an older sister, and we went to the same grade school, but she got me into Shel Silverstein. Mm-hmm. So I read A Light in the Attic and Where the Sidewalk Ends, of course. You'll notice something similar with books like this. It was poetry. It was very brief. Choose Your Own Adventure was a couple of pages, boom, turn the page, go somewhere else. I didn't have the attention span to go through and read entire things. I was reading comic books. Mm-hmm. We used to get is it Weekly Reader? Is that what it was called? The thing used to come.
Scholastic Book Fair was mine, I think.
Yeah. And I remember
we grew up in different parts of the country.
Yeah, I was in Hawaii when I was 10 years old, and here I was getting. We were all so excited when the books would show up in our English class, and we're reading little bitty
Chapter
100-page books.
yeah.
Yeah, or I was getting books that had crossword puzzles in them or something like that.
Oh, right.
So, but 10-year-old Charlene, what was she reading?
Well, I felt like it's not quite as elevated as definitely young Jane and probably Charlotte Bronte, because I think that what Charlotte mentions as Jane's reading, or what she's aware of, is something that Charlotte was also aware of when she was at a young age, because her father would let his children read anything they want. Basically, the library was open to them. I can't imagine that there were a lot of children's books in their collection, but for me, I read, I think I got into a mystery kick when I was young, where I read Nancy Drew and Boxcar Children. Remember those? Three Investigators. I loved them. And it took a little bit of time. It actually took until Tom Sawyer for me to kind of go beyond those types of books that I just find in the junior section.
What about Agatha Christie? When did you start reading her?
That was high school.
Still,
which is at the same time I read Jane Eyre. So yeah, I feel like high school was really the marking point where I changed over into more adult fare, whereas I was reading books that were still more for younger people. And I think at that in high school was when I was really enjoying adult books. I read Jurassic Park, which was too early for me. Oh. Those velociraptors gave me a few nightmares.
Yeah. Well, what's funny is I think I don't really remember the quote unquote YA books from when I was a child. Now, I mean, I remember. I mean, I had female classmates who probably read Sweet Valley High.
Yeah.
Stuff like that. But I feel like it's blown up so much after you and I were 10 years old, right?
Yeah,
when you had the proliferation of stuff like, whether it be the Twilight or the Harry Potters, which I don't even know if those are considered YA.
Yes, those are. Yeah, there's a lot of what they call early YA novels. I think maybe The Outsiders or Lord of the Flies. These are books that I read when I was assigned to read in high school, but they're considered the early YA novels, which I feel like they are not as fun as some of the YA novels that you get now, which has a lot of fantasy, or like Harry Potter, like you said. It's just, it bridges the gap between childhood and adult a little more maybe than Lord of the Flies does.
Well, yeah. I mean, I wasn't even overly familiar with YA until the very first job that I had out of high school was I worked at a public library. And so one of my favorite things to do at the end of the day was they would let me go shelve. And I had to, because I'm very meticulous. I like putting things in alphabetical order.
Organizing,
so
huh?
Yeah, and so I had to put all the books back, and we had a YA section. And what's funny to think is when I had that job, you were 10 years old. I did the math in my head, and I realized that when I was working in that library, you were 10. Okay. So I'm trying to think of if I, like I said, for some reason, all I could picture was the Sweet Valley High books.
Yes.
Those
were in the YA.
I think those were in the YA section. That's the more, because I can picture them just being so many volumes of them. Kind of like me and the Choose Your Own Adventure books. I feel like I was very fortunate that those came out and when I was that right age. But hey, you got Sweet Valley High. And Nancy Drew. And Encyclopedia Brown.
Yeah, I gotta say, I don't think I read a lot of Sweet Valley High, actually.
No, you didn't?
No. Babysitter's Club?
Babysitter's Club.
Yeah.
Maybe that's what I was thinking of, that too. And I just said Encyclopedia Brown. I think we mentioned that recently.
That's a fun one.
Those were, I remember those. I didn't read them, but I remember them. Hardy Boys. I mean, my parents had Hardy Boys books at our house. I never read them. I don't know why they had them, but they were there. Or those, what was the Golden books?
Oh, yeah. Well, those are
for
kids.
Little kids, right?
Yeah.
Okay. So that's why YA.
That's what you love to read, right? The Golden books. Just pictures.
Quick page turners.
And then you can go back outside and play basketball or something.
Yeah. I actually did a book report on a Choose Your Own Adventure book when I was a kid.
Did that go over well?
I mean, they didn't know any better.
Oh, they did.
I remember one of my best friends. He did a book report on Where the Wild Things Are, and he acted it out with the monster stuff.
Oh.
It was really impressive.
Okay, that deserves a good grade.
Yeah, I'm wondering if my Choose Your Own Adventure one got any better grade. Yeah.
Well, I think that brings me to something that I wanted to ask you. As a reader, do you feel like it's important that you identify with the narrator? Because I think sometimes I feel that Jane Eyre is sort of geared towards women because Jane is the protagonist, and you might feel affinity towards her. And I don't know how that is for someone with the male view of reading her story.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think I've spoken with you about this ever since we've met, is one of the things that I enjoy about movies and with books is that escapism. And I like to go somewhere where I can't go. That's why I appreciate a lot of movies that are period pieces, because you're going to see something that I can't see. Like, we recently watched Dead Poets Society, and I'm like, okay, we can't see what a boarding school was like in the 50s, because that time has come and gone. You can't watch Cleopatra, and you're like, okay, that's a distinct period in time.
Yes.
And so I don't know much about what orphans and governesses were like in the Victorian era.
True.
In mid-19th century England. And so that I found interesting. I can see where I wonder if girls probably have a better affinity for this book because they can understand, especially because of the romance involved.
Yes.
You know, but it didn't, I don't think it necessarily took anything away from me, because it did allow me to go to some place that I hadn't been. And what's funny is, now that you say that, I guess we can tell the listeners that for our honeymoon, which we actually did on our 1-year anniversary of our wedding, we went to England. We stayed a couple days in Haworth, where the Brontes were from. Yes. We visited the Bronte parsonage. I can tell you that the overwhelming majority of the people walking on the Bronte parsonage the 2 days we were there were women.
Yes.
But yet we did meet a couple that was there, and the man, a guy named Terry, very nice guy. I hope maybe he's listening. Terry, hi Terry, if you're listening. But he knew his stuff. He knew all about stuff about the Brontes. So I'm like, okay, it's not just for girls.
And I don't mean to put anybody in a box and say, well, this book is for this people, because I never think that a book should be only for certain people. I think everybody can appreciate anything about a book. And Jane Eyre, I love it because it has a great story, in addition to other reasons why I love it. But that great story could appeal to anybody. And I do like to see when there's just a wide variety of personalities that seem to gravitate towards the story. I feel like I did gravitate towards Jane as a character and identify with her, and that helped make this book so meaningful to me. But also the story is just a great story, and like, if you try to take someone to a movie adaptation, hopefully they can enjoy it because it's just such an interesting story.
Well, yeah, and there's no demographic that it really goes to.
Yes.
Right? This is not necessarily a YA book. I mean, that's one advantage by having a main character who spans several years.
Yes.
I mean, I guess technically you don't, the whole time you're reading it, especially when you watch some of the film adaptations and you think about how old the actresses are that have played Jane, you know, correct me if I'm wrong, but for the majority of the book, she's like 19?
Yeah, 18.
18, right? But yet she just seems to carry herself as an adult. And so, like, it's easy to say, oh, young girls will like this, but I also think adults will like it.
Yes.
And then if you're an astute reader, I would imagine that your gender probably doesn't play into it. If you can appreciate a well-written story, and Charlotte Bronte really is it's a good writer, you know.
Yes,
and
definitely.
It's definitely compelling in that regard. So, yeah, it's interesting to think, but I'm wondering if that's one of the reasons that I avoided it for so many years. Not just because I don't read. I mean, that was probably one of the main reasons.
Part of it.
That's one of the main reasons. But if you had me read Wuthering Heights first, I don't know that I would have read Jane Eyre.
Interesting.
But by reading Jane Eyre first, I was like, okay, this is really good. And then you made me read Wuthering Heights. And I have not read any of Anne Bronte's stuff yet. I've taken a little bit of a pause. That will come next.
Yeah, that's coming.
But I feel like I need a little bit of a break after Wuthering Heights, because that was not quite what I was expecting.
Right.
But I can still, like I said, I can still appreciate it being a 40-year-old man when I first read the book for the first time. Because again, escapism, and I know that's what you appreciate too.
Very true. Okay, well, I like to end our episode discussion by bringing up a passage or quote that we find particularly meaningful from this chapter. So I will go first. And actually, my quote is, what did you say?
I said, don't take my quote.
Oh.
If you dare steal my quote.
So actually, my quote is what I titled this episode, which is, "What does Bessie say I have done?" Which, for some reason, that always kind of stands out to me if it's in adaptation, where Jane, she's not saying, what did I do? She's saying, what did someone say that I do? Because I'm pretty sure I didn't do anything. So somebody said something. And I just like that level of anger in how, because sometimes when it's done right, it sounds very plaintive and like complaining, like what now?
Jane, I dislike cavillers and questioners.
But Bessie, what does she say I have done?
And I just like that side of young Jane, where she's so aware of her position and how people regard her that she's just expecting someone to say something about her.
But do you think Jane is very concerned with what other people think about her?
I think, yes. I think in the beginning, with Jane's childhood, she's very concerned about what people think about her, but she wants people to love her. And I think that will come into play at Lowood, especially, where she learns something from Helen Burns about that.
Oh, we love Helen Burns. I saw some good quotes in the book. I think I mentioned the one with about John being neither, he was not quick either of vision or conception. Mm-hmm. I do want to give a shout out. There's a really interesting line that was used to describe John's features, which said that he had thick lineaments and a spacious visage. I think that's a really
terrible. This picture painted of John, you're just like, wow, I do not want to be friends. I don't want to know him.
I don't even know what half those words mean, but it just sounds, it's really funny way to describe somebody. But the quote that really resonated with me, and it's actually one of the last lines of the chapter, and you don't even really know who says it because it doesn't get attributed to anyone. You know, it could either be Bessie or it could be her maid Abbott. And the quote is, "Did ever anybody see such a picture of passion?"
Oh, yeah.
And I think it has something to do with right after the fight, and then Mrs. Reed comes in, and then she gets Bessie and the maid to come in and like try to pull them apart, and it's something that like I don't even know if that gets brought up in the adaptations, if that's during that scene, and if so, it's probably some sort of off-camera dialogue. Right. The character's not even on screen when they say it. It's just a little muffled hubbub between whether it be Liza and Georgiana or Bessie and the maid.
What a picture of passion.
And, this is the first chapter of the book.
Yes.
And we're already getting a glimpse into what I think is one of Jane's greatest qualities, and that is how passionate she is. She's headstrong.
Yes.
She's fearless for the most part, and she's not necessarily afraid of repercussions. She's going to do what she wants to do. We're going to see that. You see that later during the romance at Rochester and how she has to make some difficult decisions. And it's easy to just be like, oh, but I really like him. But she's just like, whatever. Yes. I'm going to go ahead and start a life over again. I'm going to go. Or, even when she leaves Lowood and she's like, okay, I'm going to look for a job here. Boom. She just does it. And she doesn't stop to think about it. I mean, and I think that's what makes this novel so good. And that's kind of inspiration too, is that you don't, we joke about it that I don't necessarily believe in horoscopes, but I have been told many times. I had several people who were really into horoscopes look at me and say, "You must be a Virgo, right?"
Oh wow!
And I'm like, really? Okay, how is that? And they say, "Well, because you plan. You look at things from different perspectives. You've done the Harry Potter quiz, and I've come up Slytherin.
Yeah, and
that's something that Slytherins do, right? Is that we don't do anything without thinking about it from every perspective and try to be more calculated. And I think that's what's interesting about Jane is that she just says, "Okay, this is how I feel, and this is what I'm going to do." Yes. And it's that great passion. And Charlene, honestly, did ever anybody see such a picture of passion?
Well, we will see more of these pictures as we continue. We'll wrap it up with that. I think that's a great ending line. Great choice. Thank you for listening. As we are a new podcast, we would love to get the word out and have more people join us in celebrating this novel. So please subscribe and review us on your preferred podcast platform and tell your friends. You can find me on Twitter and Instagram at AirGuide. That's EYRE.
And if you want to hear more from me, I also host my own podcast called Out of Touchstone, where my good friend Chad and I discuss all the films that Disney produced for their Touchstone Pictures label. You can also find me on Twitter at Mike DeKalb.
Thank you, and farewell for the present.